Okay, thank you so much. So for my Keystone, I completed a thesis through the Pardee School of Global Studies, performing field research on the cases of sanctions on the former Yugoslavia and present-day Russia. I chose these two cases in order to analyze the evolution of the use of sanctions in the last 30 years, from comprehensive sanctions to targeted sanctions, with the idea of minimizing civilian harm. Additionally, both these cases address the concept of self-determination, the right of citizens to decide their nation's political status. So first, I'll give you some context for these two cases. In the case of Yugoslavia, there were two successive sanctions episodes. The first was in response to in Bosnia and Herzegovina to become independent states from the former Yugoslavia. In this presentation, when I refer to Yugoslavia, I am referring to the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Serbia, and Montenegro as seen in the right map, not the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia as seen in the left map. The second round of sanctions was implemented in response to the conflict between Kosovo Serbs and Kosovo Albanians over the governance of Kosovo. These rounds of sanctions were multilateral and comprehensive, including an arms embargo, a commodities embargo, and diplomatic sanctions. They were implemented by the United Nations, making adherence legally binding for all UN members. So then for the case of Russia, the sanctions episode I studied was implemented in response to Putin's occupation of Crimea in 2014. You can see in the map, Crimea is a peninsula in the Black Sea, a region of strategic importance for Russia, as well as a region with strong historical ties with Russia. These sanctions are multilateral, but not implemented by the United Nations, because Russia is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, which gives it veto power over any resolution. So the sanctions were only implemented by the United States and the European Union. The sanctions are targeted and include dual-use export prohibition, licensing limitations, and asset freezes. The sanctions are still ongoing, so I was only able to collect results on short-term effects. So I performed qualitative research using the snowball sampling method and had the opportunity to travel to Serbia and Montenegro. Active sanctions on Yugoslavia affected the entire population, regardless of their involvement in the conflict. The country faced extreme food shortages, gasoline shortages, and hyperinflation. You can see in the upper right-hand corner a $10 billion bill that one of my subjects gave to me while I was in Serbia. Nobody was spared from the economic crisis. People were affected across socioeconomic strata. Though the sanctions had a disastrous effect on the citizens, they had minimal effects on the Milosevic regime and gave his policies justification. Milosevic held power for years and was only handed over to The Hague for the financial benefit, not because people believed he was guilty for crimes against humanity. The effects are still felt today, as industry is only at 10% of what it used to be. The remnants of the psychological effects of isolation are seen in the cultural pessimism and the brain drain phenomenon, in which 400,000 of the country's brightest and best educated leave the country each year, while the country cannot produce 400,000 well-educated young people per year to replace them. The effects felt by Russian citizens were much more focused on political sentiment. The economic hardship felt by the population was minimal in Yugoslavia. Even though the economic impact was less, the psychological effect of isolation on the political sentiment was just as drastic. Without access to diverse media, the population became susceptible to anti-West propaganda. The majority of Russians support Putin's foreign policy. Those who don't support Putin are frustrated with his domestic policy, not the foreign policy. You can see in the quote, "Of course, it is an unpleasant reality that sanctions are imposed and will continue, but the Crimea is ours, so let it be." The population is willing to bear the cost of sanctions in order for the country to be able to follow the foreign policy it believes is right. Taking the results of my research into consideration, along with the analysis of several other cases of sanctions, I see the possibility for three policy options. The first is no future use of economic sanctions, only allowing use of less invasive measures such as diplomatic sanctions or arms embargoes. This fulfills the goal of signaling and constraining while minimizing the losses for citizens that were uninvolved in third countries. However, This option may not be drastic enough to achieve all the policy goals of sanctions. It also leaves an important gap in between the less invasive measures and the use of military intervention. A second option is no change in the use of sanctions, instead to focus on the development of aid programs. This would also minimize the losses to those uninvolved and combat the spread of propaganda, such as anti-West propaganda spread by Milosevic and Putin. This option does not account for the fact that sovereign states have the ability to deny aid, or the fact that those targeted could benefit from the aid, such as in the Iraq Oil for Food program. It would also be the most costly option, as the implementing country would have to bear the cost of aid programs on top of the cost of economic sanctions. The third policy option is to endorse only multilateral targeted use of economic sanctions with mandated coordination with the United Nations. This would also minimize losses for those uninvolved and would require less drastic change in political infrastructure. This option does still allow for counterproductive spread of propaganda and doesn't eliminate the possibility for undesired political effects. My recommendation is limited use of multilateral economic sanctions. Sanctions must be implemented in coordination with the United Nations, unless impossible, such as in the case of Russia. Less invasive measures, such as diplomatic sanctions, must be used primarily and only increased to economic sanctions when necessary. A time limit should be implemented to make sure sanctions are implemented only as long as they are still effective. Additionally, supportive tactics such as aid programs and media campaigns to increase access to translated international media should be implemented. This policy option is what I recommend to optimize efficiency of sanctions and to minimize humanitarian cost. Thank you.